Hello, welcome to another of our conversations in practical theology between Eric Stoddart and Saiyyidah Zaidi. We're going to be talking today about the commodification of religion. Now, just in a nutshell, commodification is about putting products of human labour, things that we do, into systems of financial exchange. So we're thinking today about how are the things that we do in religion actually then put into sort of economic exchange, how we make money out of that, how they're commodified. Commercialized is another term, but it's that sort of area. Maybe I'll give you a couple of examples that I was thinking about this morning. I was scribbling down a few over my Alpen at the breakfast table. And for me, within Christianity, there's a few different examples. One of them is people getting spiritual guidance or under the sort of banner of life coaching. And that's moved from being something that would happen within an exclusively religious context into actually being religious context where people are paying money for that. So there's a financial exchange going on with the spiritual guide. There's the whole thing in Christianity of pilgrimages now as tourism. So what used to be something that was done as an expression without necessarily being financially useful to other groups, of course they would have help in you would pay your way, but this now sort of pilgrimage as tourism is another thing. Cathedrals charging people entry is another, I think, form of commodification. And there's the whole business in Christianity of what we call the prosperity gospel, where if you give enough money to God, but you're really giving to the church preacher, then you're going to get a blessing. And that, to me, is commodifying religion. So those are just a few of the examples that I've, as I say, just jotted down this morning. So I don't know how you react from a different faith perspective to what's happening in Christianity, and then I'd love to hear where there's commodification in your community.
I find the whole concept of commodification really interesting, and I'll give you an example. A few years ago, we went to St. Paul's Cathedral, and you could go into the main kind of aspects of the cathedral for free. I think you had to pay to go to the Whispering Gallery, but other than that, you could access pretty much most of the cathedral as a visitor at no cost. A couple of months ago, we were passing, and I said to my kids, "Oh, let's just pop in." And we realised for the four of us to go in to St. Paul's Cathedral would have cost about £40. And it just kind of makes you think, actually. And here's the challenge that we face, because I think that buildings, for example, like St. Paul's Cathedral, has become a tourist kind of venue, let's say, and people want to visit and travel for different things. But at the same time, where is the upkeep of that building coming from? So I think in the same way as with art galleries, that I understand why they would expect a donation, but to say that there's a charge to go in automatically then alienates a number of people. Now, if you're going for a mass or a service, well, clearly it's very, very different, and you can just kind of go in at no cost. But I thought that was interesting. And then the other thing that I kind of became aware of recently as well is the Camino, you know, the kind of pilgrimage from Europe to, is it Santiago? And it's really interesting. And there was a program done on the BBC about that recently as well. And that's what drew my attention to it. And we were thinking, well, we could do that because it would be quite a nice walk. And then you realize that actually like 90% of the people today who are doing the Camino are from a non-Christian background. And so they're doing it more for spiritual reasons rather than for religious reasons. And that has then had an impact on the tourist route. So there's become much more commercialization. So I suppose I'm in a bit of a dilemma where I think that some kind of commercial aspects of religion are probably necessary in order for maintenance and things like this. But then, like you said, when you've got kind of preachers charging for blessings, that can become an issue. And so I know every now and then I'll be walking somewhere and someone will just come up and they'll give me a card and it just says spiritual healer, right? And it's fascinating for me, these things, because you know that the spiritual healing is going to require a huge amount of financial investment, and you may not even get a result. And then actually they may even just kind of like take you off on a complete tangent, right? So you're wasting time and money, and you're not even improving your relationship with God in any way, shape or form, maybe even diminishing it. And how do we then kind of respond to that? And just kind of, I suppose, one more thing in the mix is what you were saying about so-called life coaches. Now, that's quite an interesting point, because my work is as a coach. So I work as a business coach and as a high performance coach. Now, the majority of the people that come to me for my work are from a Muslim background, but I will work with pretty much anyone who's kind of like, at the level that they want to take some action. Does it then get seen that because I'm of the same faith as them, that I'm selling them religion? Or is it that I'm actually selling them and supporting them with a specific kind of intervention and kind of a training program, let's say? Because it's all to do with how it's received.
Yeah, I think it's how it's received and how it's communicated, because I think there's a big difference between someone who's doing professional life coaching. They're not setting themselves up as a religious, spiritual director or a guide. They're offering what is genuinely and rightly so a product, and therefore to earn money, this is their labor. Now, that's very different, I think, than if you're in a faith community where you're going to someone for spiritual help and guidance. If you introduce a fee payment into that relationship, there's something changes. And that's my problem within Christianity, where what's happening within the very clear, this is our faith community, we're going to help one another develop in our faith. There will be particular leaders who will help us that. We give to our religious community to support that, but we don't pay an hourly rate for, in my case, the priest giving me spiritual guidance. Yeah. If I spend an hour with him, I don't give him whatever an hourly rate would be. I would give to the church activity as a whole from which he is able to receive a living. And I think that's maybe the difference.
Yeah, and just kind of, I suppose, expanding that even a wee bit further, is that sometimes I've seen, and interestingly, even people who I know who go to church will relate something similar. The more that you donate to the cause, the more time you have with the spiritual kind of leaders. And so, Are you then donating to charity, or are you buying time?
See, I really just detest that whole approach, because it's a little bit of a tangent, but I was looking at a paper with a guy who was writing about using customer data management software in congregations. And he was saying that you can use the proxies of zip code or postcode to identify someone's area and probably estimate their giving, their salary. And therefore you could target your pastoral care and your fundraising in the church towards those who have got the most money to give. Now that to me is a horrible, horrible thing to do, because you're then basically saying if you've got more money, you'll get more pastoral care, or you'll get a bigger say in the church's decision making. And I hate the thought of that.
Yeah, it's not very clean. I mean, it's interesting because if we look at let's say the kind of salary of imams and scholars in the past from an Islamic perspective, those roles should always have been covered by the state. So I'm not 100% sure about what happens in, let's say, predominantly Muslim countries, but I know in Saudi, for example, the imams of the main mosques in Mecca and Medina, I believe that their salary is paid for by the government, and they get compensated very well. Now, that then has a number of very positive ramifications, because it means that the scholars aren't then struggling to provide a roof over their heads and provide, food on the table. So they're not then in a position of kind of having to literally sacrifice their family for their role as a spiritual leader, let's say. But also it just then frees up so much of their time to be able to then support the community. Now, what do we have within the UK? And I suppose I can only really talk about the UK and America to some degree, because that's what I know. The salaries of imams and kind of scholars is so low, it's literally bordering the minimum wage, and it's only on the minimum wage because that's now government law. Before then, it was just an absolute pittance. And so you've got families who are struggling because the let's say the main breadwinner has decided to make a decision to have a role as a spiritual leader. And I think that's completely inappropriate. And from what I understand, that's now something that's also starting within Christian and Jewish communities, where the faith leaders are just not receiving enough in terms of remuneration. So where does all the money go? And actually, like, if you're paying your imam or your scholar a decent salary, chances are they're going to be so much more committed to the role that they're doing, and they won't, not that I'm saying that they're not if they get paid pittance, but it's just life is made so much easier because they can at least enjoy life rather than struggle.
Yeah, and the other side of that is, I heard many, many years ago an argument for paying, these were actually Christian ministers, you pay ministers as little as possible so that no one does it for the money. And I thought, there's something very perverted about that.
But you would never become a scholar or a priest, or take on that role for the money. The money is there, I think, in order for you to be able to not worry about where's the food going to come at the end of the week. Yeah,
and I think that's one, certainly in Christianity, it's one of the big benefits of having denominations, because if the denomination as a national group is somehow or other, if not directly paying a salary or whatever it's called, it takes the financial exchange element away from the immediate community that are receiving the pastoral care, the spiritual guidance, the preaching. And I think it just puts an extra barrier, because if you've got lots of independent congregations where the salary for the pastor is actually directly coming from the people that usually he, but may also be she, is directly serving, I think that introduces an element of commodification that's problematic. There's something about putting a barrier in just between the people who are cared for and those who are caring for them at that financial level. It just helps keep away from this financial exchange thing.
But it's interesting, because I also think that there's something about the skill set that the scholars and the imams and the priests that they bring in. It's not just about spiritual training. I mean, I saw a job description recently for an imam, and someone said that if they could find somebody who met all of the criteria, then this person would be sought after by every single mosque in the land, because they wanted somebody who would be more qualified than the kind of leading scholar from Al-Azhar University, or more qualified than the imams of Mecca and Medina, the two holiest cities in the world. It's just not good. And then they want them to even understand kind of like the tax law and some of the legal aspects of kind of like very, very localized law. That's just not going to happen.
So in your community, there's nothing like a sort of football transfer market amongst imams, is there?
Not really. I mean, I think the good ones are always going to be sought after, right? But actually, then there's a different question to be had about what makes or what qualifies a good imam. And so, for example, and maybe that's something that we should actually pick up. You know, what makes a good spiritual leader for a congregation? But kind of briefly, I would say you need to have the Islamic education, which costs money. You know, then you need to have an understanding of the secular context within which you live, which again maybe requires some education. And then you need to be able to do your job. Can't just kind of like import people, and someone doesn't just kind of turn up ready-made and say, yes, I've got the education. It's even for example, doing your memorization of the Quran, it's a lifelong kind of journey that you go on the minute that you decide. And I think I would struggle to think why anyone would want to do that for the money, because of the amount of sacrifices that an individual has to make.
Yeah, and I'm thinking back, over 20 years ago since I was a minister, and that same philosophy was present, that you couldn't just, there wasn't a transfer market. You couldn't just bring somebody in. It had to be the right fit, and they had to have all the skills and things like that. But even though all the congregations were technically equal, everybody knew there were more successful congregations. Yeah. And despite whatever great spirituality somebody might have, there's still a little corner of, oh, it would be great to be the minister of that congregation because it's so successful. And there's a temptation there that maybe just has to be named and resisted. That there are people who will choose to go to a very small, struggling congregation, and that's their calling from God. And there are others who will choose to respond to the request from a successful congregation. And I'm not going to question their calling from God, but there can be a temptation when everything around about us is seeped in success language to want to go to the successful places.
Yeah, I mean, I suppose that's quite a difficult concept for me to understand, because I don't know of any mosque in the UK that isn't struggling in some way financially, and they heavily rely on their congregation. I mean, even our local mosque has had a debt of about, I think it was a few million beforehand. Now they're on about 300,000 in debt. So the maintenance is ongoing, but that debt is there until it gets paid off. And it's that's in a reasonably kind of not wealth. Yeah, I suppose it is a reasonably wealthy area in London, So, but I think that's actually a good thing, because it makes, as a member of the congregation, it makes me more committed to my local mosque than to one of the fancier ones that one could go to, let's say.
Now, that was a question I was going to ask you. It struck me about, there's a practice among some folks in Christianity that they'll church hop. And they'll switch from, they'll find a congregation that best suits them, which I think is a little bit like commodification. It's finding what is the product that I want to get. Are you obliged to go to your local mosque, or can you basically choose any?
That's a great question, actually. So I probably am a victim of that commodification then, because I am very selective about the mosques that I will go to. There have places that I have been to where I've had a very bad experience, and I've just thought, okay, so if you're going to behave like that, I really don't want to engage with you. There was also one place that was fundraising for money to expand the mosque, and I asked them about provision for women, and they said, oh yeah, we've got a coffee morning on a Tuesday. And I thought, fantastic, you won't be getting a penny of my money. So I am selective about where I will go, but that's because I want my, dare I call it, experience at the mosque to support my relationship with God. I don't want to go to a mosque or to hear a scholar speaking and feel kind of anything negative towards Islam as a result of it. And if I start to think like that, then for me, it's fine. They're just not my teacher. They can be somebody else's, but it's not good for me.
And how does a mosque actually raise its money? I'm thinking, certainly my brand of Christianity is very coy about directly asking for money. We sort of put that into leaflets. We maybe once a year, the preacher will encourage folks to give financially, but we're sort of, I think, a bit embarrassed about money. And maybe it's a reaction against commodification. Maybe it's just a very Scottish thing or a British thing. We just don't like talking about money. How does it work in a mosque?
I mean, I think so. For example, after Friday prayers, there's always the collection, and when I think about that, I think of it in the same way as my mother-in-law describes the collection that takes place in her church. You know, there's always something that goes round and you donate. But what was interesting is that I know people who go to church and they'll say, you need to kind of like have the shiniest, crispiest £20 note that goes into the thing, because other people are looking at what you're donating, which really, like, it's interesting, isn't it? How are you feeling pressurized to donate or to contribute? Or are you doing it because this is you genuinely giving for, you know, the sake of your church or your mosque or whatever? So, yeah.
So when that bag goes around for your offering, I'm assuming that you will be giving maybe by direct debit as well, and getting tax relief through charitable status. So your giving may actually be administrated electronically, and many people will just pass the bag around. Is that what happens in the mosque? Or?
Well, it's an interesting point, because I think that some people probably do that, and like, you know, we're coming up to the month of Ramadan, and I think there was some statistic last year that said that Muslims they donate kind of, I think they're the biggest faith group that donates to charity within the UK at the moment. And so it was a very big thing when Islamic Relief became one of the 10 disasters, what do they call it? The DEC charities that the government has. So they actually formed a strategic relationship with the government in terms of disasters emergency relief. That's it. So that was a big thing. But I think in Ramadan, there will be millions that are donated. I mean, I've heard stories of people literally even donating 1 million. Because from the kind of charity perspective, as a Muslim, you donate 2.5% of your kind of savings, let's say, after you've met a certain amount. So if you have, I think it's about £500 in the bank, then anything over that, you donate 2.5%, or including the 500. But then there's another form of charity, which is called sadaqah. And sadaqah is kind of like just general charity that you can give. So, and it's interesting because that has a financial and a non-financial aspect. So smiling is a form of charity. You know? And so I remember when we got back to the UK after traveling, so my kids had got into the habit of always giving some money to anybody homeless that they would see, or anybody in need that they would see. Come back to the UK, they get their pocket money. It's gone in a day. I'm like, what are you doing? It's like, oh yeah, we're giving £1 and £2 to every single homeless person they're seeing. So I had to explain to them that 1, it will make you broke. 2, not everybody is genuine. And 3, you can also give charity in other forms. You know, so one of the things that I'm playing with at the moment actually is time as a form of charity. So do we then give time, because actually it's probably more valuable to the organization than just a few pounds of money, you know? And so has the kind of commodification of religion just meant that everything is focused around pounds and pence?
That's interesting, because there's a long Christian tradition as well of different forms of giving to people that are not simply financial. And it's probably only more recently that it's been so heavily focused around actual cash transfer. And I think you're right that there's something about when life is so expensive that to just get by in life, you have to buy things. People have to have money of some form or another. And we're not in an agricultural context anymore where people can just exchange food or just give food, not even exchange it with one another in a small village. We're in big urban settings, and there's something very different about our social relationships now. But yeah, giving time, giving energy, and I wonder if the issue in commodification is that we're giving in order to somehow get back. That's a commodification problem. Whereas if we simply give with no expectation of getting anything back, that's gift. That's different, I think.
Mm. I mean, you're absolutely right, but it's interesting because in Islam, if you give, it's an investment in God in some ways, right? Because what you're doing is you're giving, and the scholars teach us that anything that you give is God will repay you that. It's as if you're actually giving a loan to God, and that you will get the kind of the response to the loan either in this life or in the next one. So it's kind of like, I don't even know if there is a word to describe it. It's kind of like a donation, but not a donation. It's you just kind of like making an investment of some sort. And then you're right. The question then is, are you doing it completely selflessly, or are you doing it in response for return? Because it's always more attractive to give for sponsoring orphans or giving so that people can build a water well or something like this than it is actually to sponsor a room in a hostel for someone to sleep in overnight.
Mm-hmm.
You know? And then how much, this is a horrible thing to say, but how much are the charities then to blame for the way that they have kind of come in and said, and they milk the stories around charity giving as a whole. You know, there is also another point that's coming to my mind, which is quite controversial in terms of the whole kind of refugee issue. And so I was at a conference last year, and I have to say I was quite horrified in that support was being given to refugees in Muslim countries by churches. I'm talking about Muslim refugees were getting strategic support. So in the same way that you were talking about the postcodes earlier, they were targeting them with a view, they wouldn't say this, but I can only tell you how I received it, with a view that they would support them, and then these people slowly would then adopt the faith of the church that was supporting them. And you just kind of think, well, you know, of course, if someone is in such dire need that they have no help, they need support with their immigration status, and somebody comes along of a different faith and says, we'll help you get everything that you need, of course, in the end, you're going to really question, what is my faith?
See, that's been such a centuries-old problem within Christian mission, of giving with a view to conversion and try to change people by, some would say, manipulating their need and their desperate situation. And I just can't see that is in any way really what the Christian gospel is talking about. But it is the real challenge of actually giving a gift, because that practice of targeting particular Muslim refugees in the hope that they will then gradually make a choice to become Christian, to me, that doesn't sound like a gift. That's something else. That's getting perilously close if it isn't actually into systems of exchange and commodification and stuff. But it's very difficult to get away from the idea of gift, because if we have a faith that says if we are someone who genuinely gifts, we will receive a blessing. And there's lots in the the Old Testament Hebrew Bible about receiving blessing for being someone who gives to others. And I have a problem with that, because to give with a view to getting a blessing, is that really a gift? But then, can we ever make an totally altruistic gift to someone? Is there not always something at the back of our mind? I'm going to feel better, so I'm going to gain something by the feeling of doing that. Do we just have to bite the bullet and just give?
So maybe there's something here then about giving versus guilt. Mm-hmm. So if you don't give, and actually there's even something in Islam that says that the best of the charity is where your right hand gives so your left hand doesn't even know. Mm-hmm. So it's just completely hidden, right? Now, you do that as a gift, right? Let's say. If you don't do that, do you then feel guilty about not having given, even though that you have the resources? So I think as humans, there is never going to be a situation where we can 100% give without receiving something, because even if we're appeasing our own guilt, we're still receiving something.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, that if we waited long enough to have an absolutely pure gift, we'd never give anything.
No.
And we could be over scrupulous about our spiritual intentions and try and get into some sort of state of spiritual purity that we're genuinely giving gifts. And then all needy people would just go past us, and we'd be accumulating more and more wealth because, well, we would never be able to give in an absolutely pure form.
But here's the interesting thing, right? So let's move it away from giving in terms of money, but giving in terms of the little actions like smiling or saying a prayer. I think those are done completely selflessly, you know. So if I see somebody in the street and I've nothing to give them and I say a prayer for them, actually, I don't think I'm really gaining anything. Well, maybe I am. It's interesting speaking about this, because I'm gaining the fact that I feel as if I've helped somebody. But as a Muslim, I believe that that prayer will be answered in some way, shape or form. And if I didn't say that prayer for that person, then I'm losing out on a gift that I can also receive. So I remember once, and I'll tell you the story briefly. I remember once I went into the local Waitrose to get myself a coffee and a croissant, and there was someone literally sitting on the floor, and it was 7 a.m. or something. And I'd walked in, and then the thought came to my mind, I need to go back out and ask them if they'd like anything, because who am I to have breakfast and not buy for this person? So I went back out and I asked him what he wanted. And I thought, if I was in that situation, how would I want to be treated? So I even went to the point and said, do you want sugar with your latte? You know, and when I came out and I gave him his drink and his croissant, the guy said, God bless you. And I just thought, you know, isn't it really interesting that here I am thinking I've done him a favor, but actually he's given me an even bigger favor by saying those simple words, God bless you. Because we don't know whose prayer gets answered.
No, that's right. And for those of us that are prone to overthink things, it gets a spiral of, you know, am I doing this for X reason or Y reason? Or is this person a fraudster? Are they genuine? And the overthinking can become paralyzing in this sort of realm, that sometimes we maybe just have to risk giving a gift.
Yeah, absolutely. And not give so much so that you then put yourself into a situation of extreme discomfort. I think sometimes a little bit of pushing yourself financially is not necessarily a problem if it helps somebody else out. But don't give to the point where you go broke. But absolutely, just if you give with the right intention, and I think that's one of the challenges as well that we're facing in the world right now, with kind kind of giving to churches and to charities and things, is that I actually do not know where the money goes. So someone can say to me that they have a 100% donation policy, which means that they take 100% of the £10 that I give, for example, and it goes to that particular cause, and the charity is funded by gift aid, etc. But how can I trust that? I can't. How do I know where the money that I give to the mosque goes, where the money that you give to the church goes? We don't know. So there's a huge element of trust as we're giving it, but I don't think that us not knowing should mean that we stop doing it, unless there is a very kind of like obvious and open information that's out there that says, don't support this particular project because they are, they have issues or something like that. And there was a very big or famous kind of global charity that faced that recently. And they said that as a result of the bad press, I think their charity donation went down by about 15%.
Yeah, I think what's coming through to me in our conversation this morning is that we can't separate off spirituality and giving and money and trust, and we're all woven into a society where finance and money and it's so much part of how we relate to people that it shapes who we are. And somehow finding in our faith traditions ways of stepping out of that financial framework where everything is about commodification and exchange. Maybe that's where our respective faiths can help us just to see a little bit differently, but we're still entangled in it.
And I think some of it comes back to, in some ways, a solution, for example, would be if the salaries of the mosques and the funding of the mosque was covered by a central organization. But you know that as soon as I say that people will then not trust that central organization, because it would either not cover their particular very kind of slender branch of the faith, or because they don't like somebody. Or so what is the solution? And I can't think of one. I mean, I think the way that the church is organized is great in terms of having hierarchy and to some degree having salary scales and all of that. But even then, that doesn't seem to be working effectively. I don't know what the solution is.
No, and as usual with our conversations, the solutions are not readily apparent, and that's as you know, that's not what we're trying to do. But I think certainly trying to understand the hold that money and exchange has on us, and maybe then whatever bureaucratic systems are organized, if we're all conscious of how we're shaped by financial issues and a world of financial exchange, maybe that's the best that we can do, to be aware of how we're being shaped all the time in our faith communities by the wider economic structure.
And maybe kind of also going back to what did the prophets do? How was money seen by them? And so, just looking at the examples of Jesus and Muhammad's blessings upon them, like for them, money was just a tool. It wasn't really anything other than that, and they kind of still carried on living their amazing lives in the way that they did. And if they are the examples for us, then perhaps we should shift our focus on money and commodity and the building has to have this kind of tiles and the priest needs to wear this kind of clothes, and just kind of think, actually, what is the job that needs to get done, and focusing on that.
As ever, huge issues. Again, I've greatly enjoyed our conversation. I'm just conscious of the time, and to just say to folks who are watching and for listening, thank you for listening. This has been Eric Stoddart. Hope you'll comment below, and we'd be delighted for you to listen and view into our next conversation.
Thank you.